Thank you, Sandhya. Uh, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. V Anantha Nageswaran, who's the current Chief Economic Advisor. He has a diverse background as a writer, author, teacher, and consultant. He has authored several books such as Can India Grow, Derivatives, The Rise of Finance, Causes, Consequences, and Cures. He has taught at various business schools and institutes and was in fact one of the founders of Avishkar Venture Capital Fund and the Takshashila Institution. He has had a long corporate career and serves as an independent director on several boards. He holds a postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Ahmedabad and a doctoral degree from University of Massachusetts. He's someone we're all so keen to hear about. He's been a writer, we have read his work for so long, and now he's going to talk on a topic that's very dear to all of us. As India, everyone talks of India's growth story being inevitable. How do we make that not just inevitable, but also sustainable, balanced, and equitable? Without further ado, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran.
Good afternoon, everybody. And my sincere thanks to the Asim Premji University and the Bangalore International Center for hosting me. This talk should have taken place a couple of months ago, but due to certain other developments or political calendar in the city, I couldn't make it, but I'm glad that we were able to find another suitable time to do this conversation with you. So the topic is that while there is clearly a momentum in the Indian economy today in terms of economic growth rates, there are some question marks in people's minds, partly justified and partly not, as to whether that growth is sustainable, balanced, and equitable. I'm using the word sustainable not in the sense of the environmental language or taxonomy, but in a sense of sustaining something over time. So sorry about all these graphics that my team has come up with. So this is the title of the talk, and first we will just give you a general sense of what this talk is going to cover. Initially, briefly about the growth story, the macro big picture, and then the social aspects and the various initiatives that the government has undertaken over the years, and some thoughts on the inequality debate in the country. And then what are the various goals we are pursuing on sustainable development, etc. And I will also, time permitting, talk about the challenges to growth itself in the coming years, whether it is near term or the next few years or even longer. Okay. In general, I think 2021 was the year of pandemic. Both the first quarter of the financial year 2021 and the first quarter of the financial year 21-22 were both affected by the pandemic and its impact on both consumption, investment, and various parameters of the economy. So we recorded negative GDP growth in both those quarters. However, I think clearly 2 years after the pandemic, the focus has shifted from recovery from the pandemic towards economic recapturing the heights of economic growth, if not the heights that we experienced back in 2003 to 2008, because the global factors were very different at that point. But this time, such global friendly and conducive factors may not be present. But still, from a domestic drivers of growth, there are plenty of reasons to be positive about how growth will play out in the remainder of the decade. And one of the main reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons that is going to set this decade apart from the previous one is the fact that banking, non-banking, and corporate sector balance sheets are much healthier coming into this third decade compared to what they were coming into the second decade. I'll start with this number. So if you look at the data on Indian domestic bank credit to the entire non-financial sector, which includes the government. So it was sort of hovering around 28% of GDP for the better part of the last 2 decades of the previous millennium. And then it doubled. This is a ratio that doubled, okay? So we had in the second decade nominal GDP growth averaging 10 to 12% or even slightly higher in some years. So on top of that, you have had bank credit growth rising. That is why the ratio doubled from 28% to 58% of GDP. Naturally, lots of bad loans could be made, partly due to other reasons and partly due to optimism about sustaining those growth rates, which led to a pretty strong expansion of bank credit, topped up by global capital inflows into India, etc. So it was inevitable, therefore, that this growth in bank credit wasn't sustainable and had to be therefore digested. And the second decade of the millennium, which is when it went flat, was all about digesting the growth in bank credit. Even though you might say from an aggregate absolute perspective, bank credit to GDP ratio in India is on the lower side compared to many other countries. That is true. But just because the absolute number is low doesn't mean that one can catch up with it in a very short period without encountering consequences, which is what we did in the second decade. And history tells us when we start looking for explanations as to why GDP growth of India disappointed somewhat in the second decade of the millennium, people tend to attribute it to factors such as one-off factors such as demonetization, introduction of the goods and services tax, the Real Estate Regulation Act, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, etc. They might be, some of them could have had transient influences and impacts. There's no doubt about that. But when you have a credit boom, which then gives way to a credit bust, which is what we call the financial cycle, we may not have had a financial crisis per se, but it was pretty close. When the banking system encountered double-digit non-performing assets, the non-financial banking corporation, ILFS, which was too big to fail, failed in 2018, and corporate sector had to deleverage. It was sort of a mini max financial crisis. And empirical evidence across the world tells us when there is a financial crisis, the drop from the peak of growth rate is pretty sharp. And then it stays low for quite some time. And then the recovery from the financial crisis into normal levels is quite slow, and also the inflation rate may stay low, and then the credit to GDP ratio takes time to pick up. India actually witnessed some combination of all of this. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we are trying to explain the relatively mediocre or underperformance of the Indian economy in the second decade compared to the first, one doesn't have to search for explanations that fit with one's priors. There is experience, there is empirical evidence that financial exuberance or financial excess credit growth followed by a credit bust results in such a growth performance is documented across the world. And that is what we experience. That is a more straightforward explanation than idiosyncratic explanation that we keep looking for. And you can see that also in samples with normal recession, financial recession induced by financial cycles, but with banks having a high capital ratio. But a financial recession with low capital ratios, you can see the years it takes for recovery to happen. And similarly, where there are with controls, it's even more so with the credit rationing and other controls. So basically, this is the empirical evidence that played out in India as well. And you can see here, first 2005 to 12, the credit boom that led to balance sheet stress later, phase of higher NPA due to past forbearance, then you had the ILFS collapse, then we had the pandemic, and then we had the commodity price shock of 2022 and supply chain disruptions. So as soon as the balance sheet repair got completed by 2020 or so, unfortunately, we could not start enjoying the fruits of it because you had once in a century shock of the pandemic and then the commodity price shock as well. And that is why I think with all these one-off shocks slowly fading away, we can now look forward to a better growth performance in the remainder of the decade. I would be very nervous today if we have the kind of credit to GDP ratio and the bank credit growth or corporate balance sheets that we had in 2012-13. The fact that we don't have them now and we are in the beginning stage of a new credit cycle is what makes me relatively more optimistic about the growth prospects in the rest of the decade. I kind of draw the parallel, although there will always be history may rhyme but never really repeats. There is a certain parallel to what we experienced between 1998 and 2002, and I covered this quite extensively in chapter 2 of the economic survey, which was released on January 31st earlier this year. Between 1998 and 2002, you had sanctions. In fact, there was a credit bust. Non-performing assets were rising, and Dr. Rangarajan had raised interest rates quite high. And in fact, that high interest rates is what led both banks and corporates to clean up their act at that time as well. So you had nuclear tests and sanctions that followed it, banking and corporate sector deleveraging, balance sheet repair, then as now, and then 2 successive droughts, technology bust, US recession, 9/11, everything happened. Somewhat equivalent to the pandemic, the war in Ukraine. You can think of all of those things, supply chain disruptions. So similarly on the bottom half as well. And then during this period of 98-2002, a lot of structural reforms are happening on the side, but they were overshadowed by these one-off shocks. Interest rate deregulation, actual privatization, asset recovery for banks, kind of a precursor to the insolvency framework, and then the beginning of the attention that the governments in India subsequently paid to physical infrastructure, beginning with the Golden Quadrilateral, Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, and telecom sector liberalization, which then paved the way for the IT sector boom as well. So all those things were happening, but none of them showed up in GDP numbers between 98 and 2002 because the shocks were very powerful, one-off, and they were impacting the long-run effects of these good decisions and good policy moves that are being made. And subsequently, when global conditions changed and all these impact of these shocks disappeared, a lot of things came together, and India had 5 years of GDP growth of 8 to 9% in real terms. So if we sort of now come to the current situation, 2014 onwards, it was about balance sheet repair. And then you had many structural reforms that were happening during this period. The Aadhaar program, introduction of the single indirect tax, insolvency and bankruptcy code, some privatization, rationalization of tax rates, especially on the corporate tax side, somewhat less so on the personal income tax side, ease of doing business reforms, including decriminalization, and the production-linked incentive schemes, Atmanirbhar Bharat, which exemplifies that, and the digital public infrastructure, which you are more familiar with than I am. So if you take these two together, the structural reforms happened, but financial sector problems overshadowed it. On top of that, you had one-off shocks, pandemic, global commodity price, tightening of financial conditions. And therefore now, can we look ahead to something similar between 2003 to 2008? My answer is yes, a very qualified yes. What is the qualification? The qualification is that the export sector growth isn't going to be as big a growth booster as it was between 2003 and 8, because the global economy, in my opinion, isn't in the same rude health as it was, and more so in China and other emerging markets, which was the differentiating factor between 2003 and 8. And if anything, that is the reason why I still keep my growth expectations for India of real GDP of somewhere between 6 and 7%, and to be sort of, because humans love single specific numbers, point targets, as if forecasts of economists are ever going to meet those numbers. So I would say 6.5% on average in real terms for the remainder of the decade. It will be my assessment of what the Indian economy can achieve based on what we have done so far and based on the effects of some of the actions taken already in the pipeline. If on top of that, we are going to address some of the long-standing issues at the state government level, local government level, plus in issues that we all are familiar with on education, skilling, and more importantly on the so-called energy transition, then of course, we may be able to raise this potential growth level of 6.5% to 7.5, but I'm not going to count on that. So being a relatively conservative forecaster, I'm happy to say 6.5% is something that I can say with a reasonable degree of confidence as the average expectations of real GDP growth in the rest of the decade. And it so happens that that is the forecast that the central bank, RBI, and us have zeroed in on for the current financial year. And it is very seldom that, that the central bank and the North Bloc find themselves in agreement on the growth projections that we seem to have right now, 6.5% on top of the 9.1 and 7.2. But by the way, some of you may be aware that India does publish 6 estimates of GDP numbers, okay? The 6th estimate, which is frozen 3 years later, is the final one. So the number for year ending March 2023 will be frozen in January 2026. And by the time it comes around, I have a feeling that 7.2 may actually be revised higher, because the momentum in the economy was pretty good going into the end of FY23, sorry. And FY24, 6.5% is what we expect. And so far, what we have seen in the first 4 months of the year do not give us any reason to doubt that this will be difficult to achieve. So we will keep this number. And if you look at the IMF, which is on the lower side for this year, they are 6.1. They took a small unnecessary detour, in my view, from 6.1 to 5.9 in April and brought it back to 6.1 in July. Well, it is their problem. And World Bank and the ADB have numbers closer to ours. And in general, therefore, in the G20 last year, barring Saudi Arabia, among the other 19 economies, India had the highest growth rate. Now, obviously, comparisons to China are always inevitable in several countries and also in several forums between India and China. You look at the GDP aggregate basis in dollar terms. China and India started out relatively close by the end of the millennium, last millennium, and then China surged, especially since 2005. And the gap is so huge that we think it must be due to the relative inefficiency of the Indian economy, which is also partly true. But if you look at it, I would divide China's economic growth phase is 1979 into 4 phases. 79 to 92, I would give them a gold medal for their economic reforms. 92 to 2004, I would give them a silver medal. 2005 onwards, especially until 2012-13, probably it's a bronze, and then below that, after that, it could be even something more inferior than that. Because the first phase of reforms actually had a lot of devolution to local governments, to micro and small enterprises, and then it was public sector led, export led, and then it became debt led from 2005 onwards. More so since 2008, when they realized that wrongly so in my opinion, that the center of gravity of global growth has shifted eastward, was the assumption after 2008 crisis, and they thought they could get away with a huge debt expansion. It was partly a wrong calculation about the eastward shift, and partly a sense of desperation that their export markets are going to go in a state of funk, US and European Union, and therefore they have to crank up domestic demand through debt generation. So that is why if I deflate the dollar GDP of both the countries by the dollar debt of the non-financial sector in both the countries, India's line, which is the light blue line, actually lies above the China's line in the chart on the right. So in other words, per unit of debt, India has generated more dollar GDP than China has. It is one way to say that we still have some more room to expand our debt ratio and grow, but of course, China's story also provides us a cautionary tale on how far you can take it. Okay? So in that sense, again, if you take out the China line, India's line, in and of itself, I was telling some of people before we came into this hall, in 1993, India's dollar GDP was just under $300 billion in nominal terms. By 2023, it is at $3.4 trillion by March 23. So in 30 years, you have had roughly 12 times increase in nominal dollar GDP in India, even as the Indian rupee weakened from 30 to 80 in this period. So it is a tremendous achievement over multiple governments, coalition, single party, few parties, dollar depreciation, many crises. Yet dollar GDP has gone up by 12 times, and without taking so much of debt on board. So I think these are all the fundamental strengths that we need to recognize. Now, of course, I'll come to this is the sort of the macro big picture story, things that I didn't cover. I can address them during the Q&A. And if you look at the social aspects of the growth story, that is what I'll share some of the statistics. Of course, this is a quote from Kautilya. In the happiness of his subject lies the king's happiness, in their welfare, his welfare. He shall not consider as good only that which pleases him, but treat as beneficial to him whatever pleases his subjects. It's well articulated, easy to understand, but I'll be walking the talk here. Oops, sorry. Let me go back to the previous slide. I think it takes time to load. So what are the strengths? A parliamentary republic, federal system of governance, fast-growing economy, recent strides in public digital infrastructure, a population that now aspires to be at the top of the food chain in terms of standards of living and GDP. The opportunity is, of course, a most populous country. Youth bracket is quite big. Nominal per capita income is around 2 lakhs per annum. Literacy rate of 74%, which is rising. And what are the opportunities also? It's the demographic dividend, median age 28.2, working age population to total population is rising and is projected to continue to do so for 13 more years. And this youth bulge can be a big boost to economic growth. And it has been the case for many countries. And of course, the challenges, pluralistic, multilingual, multi-ethnic, one-size-fits-all solutions not feasible simply because each state is larger than a European country. And more importantly, these challenges do not include some of the global challenges which are also present, especially if you were to ask me to name the most important challenge or threat to India's growth, is the current global narrative around climate change, global warming, and energy transition. I'll say more about that later. In terms of what we are doing on the social sector, and here, since many of the responsibilities related to the social sector lie with the state governments, I am showing on the top center expenditure as a percentage of GDP on social services, including both the union and the state governments. Okay. So one is as a percentage of GDP, the second bar is a percentage of total expenditure of the governments, and third, expenditure on social services in lakh crores or trillions of rupees, which is a line, 11.4 trillion rupees or 11.4 lakh crores to 21.3 lakh crores, roughly doubling. So you might say, so it's about 14% compounded growth rate. This is in nominal terms, okay? And since inflation has been relatively on the lower side, about 7% or 6%, you can say in real terms, it's been growing at 7 to 8%, the overall general government expenditure. Specifically on expenditure on education health, which is also largely a state government responsibility, you have it on the bottom. The figures are in absolute rupee terms. And then in terms of allocation to major social sector schemes. So in other words, there has been no depth of availability of resources for some of the key aspects of the social sector achievements, and definitely they are also important for achieving economic growth as well. So it is not that the outlays always translate into outcomes, and many a time we confuse the absence of outlays as a de-emphasis on the priority or on the outcome, which is not the case, because one can always for example, when 38 years ago, when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi said only 15 paise of every rupee that we spend went to the ultimate beneficiary, and if somebody were to come and improve the efficiency and plug the leakages and ensured that 30 or 40 paise on the rupee went to the ultimate beneficiary, and in the process reduce the overall allocation, because now he or she is able to ensure more money goes to the ultimate beneficiary, the actual reduction and the expenditure is meaningless as a metric to compare the commitment to social sector. So major initiatives for better overall health is also part of the commitment to social sector. We have again given you multiple milestones, the various schemes introduced over the years from 2014 onwards until the most recent budget. So again, I don't want to spend time going over the details. You may be able to read them yourself. And effectively, the point here is that there is contrary to some of the perceptions, there is no lack of attention or there is no lack of prioritization of the key elements that constitute the founding pillars of economic growth. So without a healthy population, which we saw in the COVID time, or without education attainment, we are not going to get the 6.5% or even higher growth rates that we are anticipating. And if you look at the National Family Health Survey number 5 coverage, and on the right side, you see the change from National Family Health Survey number 4 on child vaccination and vitamin A supplements. On the right side, institutional births and delivery care. Wherever you see lots of green on the right simply means that the improvements have been 100% or double. So clearly, in several of these aspects across the country, while the stock of issues that we face is still quite formidable and long, the direction of the journey is correct. And the incremental progress is significant enough to be noticed. And yes, we know that, and many of you in this audience would have known this, and I'm sorry for repeating it. It is always true that for a country of this size, which is after all still a lower middle income country, whatever good things I might say, you might say there are plenty of other things that need to be attended to, or whatever plenty of things that you are worried about, I can list plenty of good things that are happening. And as Joan Robinson put it, whatever you say about India, the opposite is equally true. But therefore, each one of us, when it comes to a large country like this, is actually like the 5 blind men trying to figure out the elephant. Okay, it is never going to be possible for us to get the full picture. That is why different perspectives have to always be in dialogue with each other to get the full picture. And that is what I'm trying to do here. And in terms of the other concerns that we all have today, apart from health and education and allocations and so on, one of the things we have is the employment situation. The absence of national level data on employment, including rural India, is both a problem and an opportunity. It is a problem because we have only quarterly survey on urban employment, and we do get the annual data on rural employment. It is a problem, so the data has to improve. The data has to become available for both urban and rural India. But it also presents an opportunity for people because since there is no data, each one of us can find the anecdotal data that suits our bias and prejudices. So that, in that sense, it's an opportunity. Therefore, we are forced to rely on. Okay, so I think the mic is working. So we are forced to rely on many other indicators and piece them together for a sense of where employment stands. So today we have the purchasing managers indices on manufacturing and services, which are both showing an expansion, which means employers are looking to expand their workforce. The number above 50 shows it on the left side, rather than employers trying to contract their workforce. And then, yes, I know I saw the article in the Hindu a couple of days ago about the payroll additions and the EPFO. I'm not convinced of that article. We can talk about that later. But the fact remains that whether it is temporary employment or permanent employment, the net payroll additions under Employee Provident Fund organization is a good indicator of lower wage level formal employment generation. And that number for 22-23 is rising and well above the previous years. And also, if you look at the number of persons demanding work under Manrega is beginning to come down compared to the previous years. Yes, the annual unemployment rate, because of the fact that rural data is only available with a huge lag, so we are still talking about 21-22 data on the right, on the left side. But when it comes to urban unemployment data, we do have all the way up to March 2023, and MOSPI has done a good job on improving the timeliness of the urban unemployment rate data releases. So for example, for the quarter ending June, we should be getting the data very soon. So we are at 6.8%. This number did shoot up to 20% during the pandemic years. Again, had a slight bump up in the second pandemic wave in April to June 2021. In fact, for example, there was also a lot of controversy about Indian GDP data, but none of those controversies were aired when Indian real GDP contracted by more than 20% or 25% in the first quarter of 2021. In other words, when the GDP contraction exceeded most people's fears, then Indian GDP data was reliable. When the Indian GDP data publishes numbers which do not accord with many people's pessimism, then the GDP data are suspect. So then obviously we have to be very clear about where we stand before we question the data. So are we looking for confirmation, or are we looking for data or analysis or objectivity? That is something we need to keep in mind. Okay. So we all know that stories sell better than statistics. And in fact, there was this very good Tamil film back in the early 2000s called Anbe Shivam, starring Kamal Hassan. And there was this beautiful street play on the rapacious capitalist versus the hapless working class. And I think but I don't go into the merits or demerits of that situation in that movie or in general. The fact is, those kinds of anecdotes and powerful illustrations leave a large impact on people's psyche. So it's equally important to supplement or look for specific stories. And that is what we have tried to do in the rest of these couple of slides here. So for example, this is the story of a Pakka house from the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, and it is in Uttarakhand. And then this girl in Leh gets the first tap water connection, and it is located 325 kilometers away, Demchok, from Leh city at a height of 13,800 feet, where mercury can drop to -40. And then you have in the tribal village of Bulumgawan in Maharashtra receiving electricity supply in 2018, nearly 70 years after independence. And then you have other stories of tap water saturation achieved in Kanchipuram, 100%. And then this gentleman in Sirsa, 70-year-old Maniram, saving $1.5 lakh on a heart surgery under Ayushman Bharat. And then you have other stories of the Burhanpur district in Madhya Pradesh having tap water connections compared to 37% in 2019, 100% of the households being connected as well. In fact, the box in this slide at the bottom, while you can read the rest of the stories on the other three main pictures here, the graphics here, I would like to highlight that box item at the bottom. Professor Sudipto Mandal actually undertook a visit to the state of Jharkhand, which he had gone 50 years ago, specifically, so it is a backward state, and he went to 4 backward regions in that state. This article appeared in Mint in November 2022. It is still available on the internet. You can look for it. And what he saw across governments, across political dispensation over the last 50 years, what has changed since his previous visit was that he basically saw considerable progress in physical infrastructure, such as roads, houses, digital connectivity, adequate irrigation facilities, public distribution system, and education facilities. Combined with the intervention of the state and the general market development, extreme deprivation and hunger have been eliminated in these villages. These are his words. So I think it's important for us, while we always have to learn from our failures, we also have to learn from our successes, and having pride in what we have achieved also provides the right impetus to carry on with the remaining tasks as well. And very recently, 2 weeks ago, the multi-dimensional poverty index of the Niti Aayog was released, and some of you may have seen it already. It looks at various indicators, not just the per capita income or consumption, household consumption, because ultimately what a poor person, basically you are calling someone poor because they don't have the purchasing power to avail of many services. But if those services are made available to them in other ways, then effectively even the lesser number of rupees they earn can be allowed for discretionary spending. So then you have to measure poverty on a multi-dimensional basis rather than narrowly at per capita income or per capita household consumption, etc. So on that basis, UNDP came up with the multi-dimensional poverty index, and the second release of it in India was done recently, and it covers the pandemic period, although not fully. So you can see the poverty headcount ratio dropping from 24.85% to 14.96%, and the intensity of poverty dropping by 3 percentage points roughly. And overall multi-dimensional poverty index is about 6.6% compared to 11.7% in the previous such survey or assessment. And you see on the bottom the difference between rural and urban. Rural is still about 19.28% on a headcount ratio basis, urban is 5.27%. And how well each state has done, basically in almost all the states, there's been a significant decline in the multidimensional poverty headcount ratio. And you can see here that largest improvements happened in states like Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, UP, Orissa, and Rajasthan. In fact, if you look at the Ministry of Education's educational attainment survey, which happens once in 3 years, what is interesting is that some of the states that were used to be called Bimaru states, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh in particular, and Orissa or even Haryana, are doing better than the national average on science, math, and English and other languages compared to the southern states. So some of the sense of superiority that some of the southern states used to enjoy about their educational attainment being higher than the national average, it doesn't come out very clearly in the education survey between years 3 and 12, standards 3 and standard 12, which is the Ministry of Education survey, which has got several private sector participants as well in the committee. So I think some of the laggard states are indeed catching up faster, and that is a good sign for the overall national average as well. It is not just in the multidimensional poverty index, but also in the education and proficiency in science and math and languages compared to national average. And the district-wise multidimensional poverty index score, how it looked in 2015-16 compared to 2019-21, you can see the transparent improvement as well. On the inequality front, I think there is considerable attention, and rightfully so. In general, the problem here is that we know that the last consumption expenditure survey data is available only for 2011-12, and the next household consumption expenditure survey has been initiated, and based on the therefore these results should be out in 2024. The rural Gini coefficient was almost the same in 2004-5 and 2011-12. Urban Gini coefficient increased marginally from 35 to 37. But you can also, given the fact that we have to go back to 2011-12 data and do not have the most recent data, you can look at the inequality through other poverty related indicators. There exists other ways. One is the multidimensional poverty index, which you just saw now. And then the National Family Health Survey number 5, huge strides made in quality of life, and also the UNDP Multidimensional Poverty Index report, which came out last year. And the Center for Commitment to Equity in Tulane University did do some work similar to what the Congressional Budget Office does in the United States. They basically look at the distribution of household income, pre-transfers and taxes and post-transfers and taxes. And the Gini coefficient does come down quite significantly in the United States as well. In other words, fiscal policy does what it is supposed to do. Tax system is progressive and there are fiscal transfers. This is available with a 2-year lag. For example, today, if you go to the website of the Congressional Budget Office and look for distribution of household income, you can see the data for 2020, but not 21 or 22. I think probably even 2019 will be what's available right now. So anyway, so in the similarly for India, what they did was they took the pre-fiscal income, subtract the direct taxes, add back direct transfers, indirect subsidies, in-kind transfers, and come up with the final income. And what they found was inequality estimates taking into account all this was actually 0.367. This is based on 2011-12 data, and it has come down to 0.311 after making these adjustments for transfers and taxes. This is consistent with what we saw for several other countries as well. In fact, this slide is a little bit difficult to read. I'll go back to other countries' data. Yeah. So if you look at the other countries' data, for the United States, for example, the Gini coefficient drops from 0.516 to 0.432 in 2019 after accounting for transfers and taxes. Same thing in Brazil, it drops from 0.67 to 0.55. Indonesia, it drops from 0.39 to 0.37, and for Turkey, it drops from 0.485 to 0.378. So similar results have been obtained for India based on 2011-12 data. And we have actually tasked the World Bank, in the absence of the next household consumption expenditure survey, which should be available to us in 2024, we also requested the World Bank to see whether they can update the CEQ results and how the inequality looks, taking into account the various fiscal transfers that I have shown you earlier in the presentation. And this is the result that they showed for India. And overall, none of this presentation up to this point is to deny the amount of task that still lies ahead of us, as I said. And there should be no sense of smugness or complacency. We are still ranked 121 out of 163 in Sustainable Development Goals. The country score is 60. The regional average, forget about the global average, the regional average is 66.9. And where India stands in different areas is shown here. And some of the images on the bottom may not be that easy to read, but it's available all on the UN SDG report website as well. So clearly the task ahead for India is still equally formidable, as impressive as the achievements have been. So overall SDG goals, 17 of them, 169 targets, almost impossible, many promises to keep by 2030. And in fact, among the many countries, beyond Lombok and Bibek Debroy's work show that India is on track to achieve them around 2059, 30 years later. But other countries are even further behind in terms of meeting the SDG goals, which should be achieved by 2030. And in the Indian context, they have said, if you want to get the maximum bang for the buck, they have identified 12 specific areas which they want to focus on. Just as the startup investors look for higher multiples of exit, they identified these 12 areas where there is a higher multiple in terms of the reward to money spent ratio. So in terms of where we are, I think I did mention to you that the challenges we face are not just with respect to SDG goals. We have multiple other issues with respect to the state government finances or the power sector reforms, or I spoke very briefly about the energy transition, which I can touch upon later. But the point remains that growth is not something that we pursue for its own sake, but evidence tells us that countries that achieve sustained income growth also achieve sustained development in other goals that we are interested in, such as health attainment, nutrition, institutional delivery, overall literacy rates, gender participation, gender equality. All those parameters are indeed positively correlated with growth as well, because a sense of insecurity and a sense of lack of confidence disappear as growth and prosperity levels increase, and our mind is able to think broadly and horizons become wider. And that is why growth is not important for its own sake, but for what it delivers. On that parameter, I think we are better placed than many other countries today in the world, having put behind us some of the issues that dogged us in the second decade in terms of growth. But you can be rest assured that we are not resting on our laurels, and that we are quite aware that on SDGs and several other important parameters, the road ahead is long, even if the journey has already crossed multiple milestones. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nageswaran. That was, I think it was a fabulous combination of perspective and precision, because not only did you provide the spread and the canvas which is broad, but you also stuck to your time like nobody would have. Think it's so perfect, and I know you were tracking it on your phone. Thank you so much for that. Gives us enough time for Q&A. I know sheet has been circulated for collecting the questions, but I thought I might kick off by asking a couple of questions. The first is obviously the big elephant in the room for India is agriculture and agricultural productivity. And given that close to, depending on the estimates, 48 to 52% of working people are work in the farm sector, and the productivity there is, and its contribution to the GDP is low. How do you think of that, and what do you think one should be doing on that? Kamash.
Yeah, no, I agree that, first of all, thanks for your comments. And yeah, I didn't touch upon agriculture, but in general, our attention to the monsoon is probably disproportionately bigger than what it deserves to be. And it has got more of a sentiment effect than a real effect because the area under irrigation coverage has increased substantially over the last several years, several decades also. More than 50% of acreage is covered by irrigation. And then if you look at the uh, agricultural exports, which are now actually, I mean, we do have temporarily bans and restrictions on exports, but we have become a net exporter from where we were. And therefore, expecting agriculture to grow at 3 to 4% or even possibly at 5% is not unrealistic. And to some extent, the farm sector reforms that were pulled back in 2021, I think, should probably be revived because it expands the choice set available to our farmers and something which they were actually asking for back in 2010-11 themselves, even in those states that are where currently we saw some resistance. And it is something that outside of the political discourse, many parties have subscribed to actually. I think that that needs to come back. And I think our agricultural productivity, from what I see, yes, again, we are not anywhere near where, for example, China has been. But if you're able to move away from food grains to other crops, and especially in pulses where still we rely tremendously on imports, I think we can do far better. So I would say it is still an area which has the potential to contribute to GDP growth and also for transforming rural landscape and rural incomes and livelihoods. So we have barely scratched the surface of agricultural productivity and exploiting its potential for both rural prosperity and for exports as well.
Just as a quick follow-up, given where we could be from that sector, and coming back to what you said, the demographic dividend and the young people in the country, do you see the shift of people, the labor, to get more utilized and therefore the output growing in the agriculture versus it shifting from this sector? Obviously, there will be a combination of both, but which side of the continuum do you see more likely?
But it is a trend in all countries around the world, developing or developed, that as they cross from poor to low income to lower middle income, etc., there is a natural attrition of labor in agricultural sector. And it's been happening in India as well, from 65% now down to below 50%. Maybe the pace of change in India has been relatively slower than others, but again, I wouldn't necessarily consider it as a bad thing because sometimes having a population not entirely dependent on industry and urban centers, but if you're able to provide them livelihoods and employment in their own places where they are, it's actually not a bad thing. So I'm not particularly concerned that the pace of shift from agri to non-agri of labor force being low, on pace being slow, isn't something that I'm worried about. But it will happen because it's inevitable. Because naturally, with rising standards of living, our expenditure on food doesn't rise proportionately. And that is true for all families. And that is the reason why agriculture as a sector normally hits its natural limits of growth. And that is why the labor force employed there will naturally tend to decline and productivity will increase. That is par for the course.
I'm going to take a moment to absorb these questions, but so I'll ask you for another one that was in my mind for a while. We talk of industry and especially the small businesses, because talk on inclusivity. I know your own passion on the last man, last business. That sector has had a bit of a roller coaster ride in some sense. Where do you see its position? And if I may just add a layer of complexity to that, but we also have the same focus we have on technology. And a lot of technology today talks of replacement of labor. And the biggest impact of that seems to be more on the smaller end business. For example, the subcontractors or the kind of people. I mean, how do you see the role of small and medium businesses, and where do you see that from a policy perspective?
There are two aspects to your question. One is the role of technology and the impact on MSME. And if I keep that aside for the moment, what is happening to the MSME sector? Yes. So let me tackle the first part. I think the MSME sector has been getting fairly good deal of attention lately, and for good reasons. For example, you can imagine the counterfactual as to what would have happened to them but for the emergency credit line guarantee scheme during the pandemic years. And also the advent of GST and the acceptance of invoices for input tax credit being used as a collateral for working capital loans, that is beginning to pick up. And third, the development of the receivables discount exchanges, which allow large firms to accept the invoices on these platforms, and for these factors and discount agents to financial institutions to pay the MSMEs on time and then collect their monies from large enterprises. That is something that needs to grow. Many large enterprises do not allow their invoices to be registered on these receivable discounting exchanges, citing various reasons, many of which are not very persuasive. And I don't mention only private sector, but also public sector enterprises, public sector departments like railways and defense, etc., where there is a lot of contracting from MSMEs. And if those invoices are allowed to be discounted on these receivable exchanges, then the cash flow situation for MSMEs will improve tremendously. The other thing that happened in the budget of 23-24, announced in February, many people may not have noticed it. There is a very important nudge given in the budget. That is, a large enterprise cannot claim as a deductible business expenditure payment made to an MSME unless it is actually paid. So earlier you can claim business expenditure from your taxable income if it is accrued, but here it has been made contingent on actual payment. So from the access to finance angle, much has been done. And then here you must be aware very well, in this city, the open network digital commerce, ONDC, has a great potential to induce both formalization and financial and market expansion for MSMEs. And the number of registrations of MSMEs on the Udyam portal in the last 2 or 3 years have exceeded what happened in the previous 15 years. So there is a plenty of formalization that is happening. So I think if you keep the technology question, which I come to next, aside, I think MSMEs have been getting the attention, and it is something that both personally on my part and the Ministry of Finance are very committed to, because we understand the role that the Mittelstand played in Germany and also in other countries like Japan, etc., even in Korea. So I think this is something that we need to continue to work on. Now, the technology question is the harder one. And I think it is going to affect not only MSMEs, but even larger enterprises. And that is something by which there is no, I cannot pretend to have the answer, because many things that we were banking on to generate employment are going to be taken away by, let's say, artificial intelligence. Right. And the amount of new jobs that they create, especially in the short run, may not be adequate to replace the jobs that are displaced. And not all those who are displaced may be able to be trained in these new jobs as well. So there is going to be a huge gap there. And we need to recognize this. The first step is to recognize this as a formidable problem. Right. To tackle. I think that realization is happening, but I don't have answers to this. It will be presumptuous on my part to think that I can give you ready-made answers.
No. I think that's absolutely fair, and I've got a lot of questions, and but I'm going to, and I'm upfront apologies that if I will not take all these questions, obviously in the interest of time. And some of them are such that I might not understand them also, given my own limitations, nothing to do with the questioner, let me assure you. But those that I can understand and I can articulate, let me ask Professor Nageswaran. One of them is also topical, because people have talked, and we talked about it briefly before, is about the constant election cycles are throwing up a lot of promises and some amount of fiscal profligacy coming through certain election promises made. That sometimes one of our audience says that constitute kicking the spending down the road and potentially bankrupting these states at this point in time. So the question seems to be is that are we lax in the implementation of FRBM in this context, and especially in coming to imposing fiscal discipline on some of these? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a multi-layered question. And first of all, very broadly, our combined fiscal deficit is about 8.5% of GDP, state and center put together, which is on the high side. And our overall debt ratio, around 80% plus, is also on the high side. And that is why the interest outgo as a percentage of tax expenditure, tax revenues in India is on the high side compared to other G20 countries. These are the facts. At the same time, it's also a fact that India's nominal GDP growth is well ahead of its cost of capital.
Right.
At 11% or 12% nominal GDP growth comfortably exceeds the 7% borrowing cost, which is true even for state governments. They borrow at 7%. And third, India doesn't borrow in foreign currency. India borrows from its own people. So in a way, India's fiscal outflows are transfers, indirect transfers from the government to the public. And it gets recycled in some fashion or the other. In terms of public expenditure, private sector, consumption expenditure coming back as GST, etc. So I think we need to be, yes, it is something that we need to work on. Maybe a combined fiscal deficit in the medium term of around 6% of GDP and a combined fiscal gross government debt of around 60% of GDP will be good to have in the medium run. And some of the fiscal giveaways that are being promised now, such as return to the old pension scheme, etc., may have implications 10 years down the road, if not necessarily now. And so I think some states like Andhra are trying to come up with via media solutions. Other states may follow them. So I wouldn't necessarily come to the conclusion that it is bankrupting the country. Right. They are issues of concern. But for example, if you look at the transmission and distribution losses or DISCOM losses, they have come down in the last 2 years. And smart metering and compulsory metering have taken hold as well. And along with the fiscal giveaways, many states have recently revised their property tax valuation basis. They have raised user charges on transportation, on electricity consumption, etc. So those good things are also happening on the side. But certainly I would concede that if you ask me whether more work remains to be done compared to work that has been done, the answer is yes.
Sure. I'm going to jump areas, and it's an interesting topic with increasing volatility due to various kinds of shocks. What are your thoughts on would it be more productive to conduct census in every 5 years versus 10 years?
Let's first get the 10-year cycle going.
That was one of the questions. This is another question, and we briefly talked about it in terms of perspective before. Whole talk about this climate change and where does India stands, what's our own stand given our multi-dimensional poverty, and we also talked about the role that some of the people who are talking of climate change and setting the rules are thing. So can you just talk a little bit about where do you think India stands and how should India be looking at climate change?
So we have our own nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and we had set goals for 2030, and we have comfortably exceeded those goals, and therefore we have even raised the targets for where we want to be in terms of installed capacity from non-fossil fuels, etc. So I think while we may not have a clear roadmap or where we go from 2030 to 2070 at the moment, 2030 we are comfortably on course to meet our own targets. But that is a minor part, because we also have recently, when Prime Minister Modi went to the US, we became members of the Mineral Security Partnership, which only was open to 11 countries, and India has also been admitted. This is about securing the supply of critical minerals and rare earths required for renewable energy generation. We know that bulk of it is available only in a few countries, but the processing of bulk of the rare earths and critical minerals happens mainly in China. So it is both an energy security imperative and also a national security imperative to have mineral security. But all that being said, I think to classify fossil fuels as dirty fuel and to say that we cannot have anything to do with fossil fuels is not only arrogant, but also is a matter of double standards. The moment we use the word dirty versus clean, etc., we are not fully measuring the amount of energy that is expended even in extracting critical minerals, processing them, and putting it into electric vehicles. If you measure the entire emission chain from the time the materials are extracted from the ground all the way up to the exhaust pipe, a hybrid vehicle is more environment friendly than an electric vehicle. So many things that we call as greenwashing, including, in fact, we should include even the near religious belief in electric vehicles as also equivalent to greenwashing. because we are only considering the emission coming out of the exhaust pipe. Okay, so we will need to rely on conventional energy sources for longer than we think. And the golden mean for many countries rests between the trade-off between the cost of climate inaction and the cost of action. And the emphasis on emission mitigation is a priority for the developed world because they have emitted in the past. And that is what has squeezed the carbon budget for all of us for the next 50 years. And therefore, they are focused on the future emitters than worry about the past emissions. But we have to focus on the consequences of the emission that's already out there. Because the half-life of carbon is 120 years. So if you were to emit 1 ton of carbon today, carbon dioxide today, at least 1 kilogram of it will be there in the atmosphere until about 1,648 years. Okay, so that is why countries like ours are going to face the consequences of the emission that's already been done. So we need to focus on adaptation and resilience than on emission mitigation. But the global discourse set by the West focusing on emission mitigation, which means you have to sacrifice on your growth outcomes. But growth is not antithetical to climate change because you need growth to generate the resources which in turn can be used to invest in energies efficient technologies or non-fossil fuel sources of energy. Because if you don't generate your own resources, you have to rely on foreign capital, which means correspondingly, those who know macroeconomics will understand that it has to translate into a higher current account deficit. So therefore, all these dots have not been connected. And in fact, even in European countries, few academics are beginning to raise these questions, saying that the European Union's pursuing this climate change as almost a near total religion. They themselves don't understand the economic consequences of what they are doing. In fact, it led me to formulate what is called in macroeconomics, some of you might know the impossible trinity of open capital account, independent monetary policy, and if I may pose a question, what's the third one?
Exchange.
Open capital account, independent central bank, and what is the third node? Yeah. Fixed exchange rates. Very good. Fixed exchange rates. So this is the impossible trinity, 3 nodes. So the impossible trinity of net zero, and I would like to stake the intellectual property rights on this one. Net zero transition, economic competitiveness, and fiscal sustainability constitute impossible net zero trinity. At any given point in time, we can have only 2 of the 3. And this is something that European countries don't fully appreciate. And they are actually, and just recently, EU and the UK household surveys were done by YouGov. And those surveys say their households are all in favor of green transition as long as it doesn't cost us anything. So the costs are being sought to be transferred to developing countries. So I think that is something we need to be very clear. We cannot forswear our policy choices and our energy choices. And this, to me, is the single biggest risk to economic growth and economic convergence between developed and developing nations.
Some of them must repeat. So this is, I'm going to just slightly tweak the question from the way it's put in. This is about, and you talked about the data and inclusion of the data. India is also home to a very large informal economy. There's a lot of effort to bring that into the thing. But does it often mean that for their lives and their lot to be improved, getting them into the formalization is the only or the best route to improve their lot? Or otherwise, very often they end up remaining marginalized and at the fringes almost all the time. So is the only way to get them into informal, or are there different ways economically of addressing them, targeting them?
So historically, I think Schleifer and Vishny, Andrei Schleifer and Robert Vishny, I think have done a lot of work on this. Basically, how countries have addressed informality or informality having gone down as a percentage of the overall economy is because the formal economy keeps growing in size and the informal economy, therefore, as a percentage of the overall economy goes down. because it is never really possible for all informal sector workers to be integrated, because some of them may choose voluntarily to stay informal as well. But if what the government should try to do in that case is to somehow make sure that some of the benefits that formal sector workers enjoy or government schemes have to be made available. That is why we have come up with this things like the e-Shram portal, etc., which at least make sure that they get access to government benefits. And first of all, in India, how large is large when it comes to informal sector is also a matter of debate, because 6 months after the goods and services tax was introduced, my predecessor, Mr. Arvind Subramaniam, did one essay in the economic survey for 2017-18. And based on some of the GST related data, which is barely 6 to 8 months old, he actually made the case that the informal sector was probably half of what was being discussed, 80% or 90%. You were talking about somewhere between 35 and 45% in 2017-18. And if you look at, for example, I'll give you one data. The GST has migrated taxpayers. That is, people who were paying sales tax before, who migrated. And there are new taxpayers. The migrated taxpayers pay on an average 4 lakh of rupees per annum as GST, on average. The new GST taxpayers pay 1.1 lakh on average per annum. So the new GST entrants are therefore smaller enterprises, and that is a sign of formalization. And I spoke about the Udyam portal registrations. That is formalization. And if you look at the potential for ONDC to formalize, providing access to global markets even for the smallest enterprise, that is formalization. So we need to have a clearer indication of what is formal sector, what is the informal sector. So I think we are doing both conscious efforts to make some of the excluded sectors and population segments into the formal segment. And secondly, as the formal sector expands and becomes more prosperous, there will also be diffusion tendencies happening, which will make sure that some of the facilities available to the formal sector diffuse them to them also. So this is two-pronged ways to address this issue.
So I'm going to now ask you a question from an undergrad student from the audience. As an undergrad student entering the job sector, it's daunting given the challenges in the youth ratio and the jobs. So she asks, will there be enough jobs for an undergrad right now?
So, I mean, the straightforward answer to the question is yes. But what kind of answers, what kind of job that she should be looking for, that will keep changing depending on the way the economy and the global, national and the global economy progress. And I think a tremendous amount of, unfortunately it is true, a tremendous amount of intellectual and emotional flexibility will be needed to be able to remain employed. And secondly, you may also want to consider much more different forms of being employed than what is traditionally understood. These are all the ways in which you can basically, is it employment that you are seeking, or is it certain level of economic self-sufficiency you are seeking? So depending on the way you pose the question, the answers will also be different.
For a change, not an answer, but a couple of suggestions on the economic survey document from people in the audience. There's a request that the economic survey devote some space for covering digital services such as online games and so many that are coming up right now. And two is that, can there be some amount of inclusion of cost of an economy on account of poor infrastructure, like bad traffic, etc. Can that also be covered in the economic survey? So I'm just leaving that as a thought for you.
No, both the points are well taken. For the second suggestion, can there be a section on the cost of poor infrastructure, for example? Is there any economic student in the audience?
Yeah, there are.
Plenty, right? What is the answer to the question that you would give? At a conceptual level. What is one thing that distinguishes economics from physical sciences?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Remind me of Hayek's Nobel lecture. It's basically it's a soft science. It's not really.
That's okay, but why is it soft science?
Because because
some-
you can't run experiments. It's not a lab.
So you're almost there.
There's a lady at the back.
You're almost there with the answer. Sorry?
Yes, ma'am. You.
Okay, no, but for this question, the impossibility of counterfactual. That is what makes economics so argumentative, right? So how can I can talk about the opportunity cost of infrastructure, poor infrastructure, but how do I get to measure it? Because by definition, it is difficult. Okay? So one can compare a previous state and the next state and say, because infrastructure improved, this is how the GDP improved. You can do some, after the fact, you can kind of say that, had it continued, had this infrastructure not been put in place, something might, so this is the difference. But even then, you can't control for all other factors that might have happened. True. Infrastructure may improve, but something else might have gone wrong in that place. Then how do you take the net improvement or net deterioration? So by definition, these are all difficult, and this will become very subjective exercise, and the line between subjectivity and arbitrariness is very thin.
Sure, that's fine. There's another question which is, again, is the rapid increase in retail credit a concern for you in India?
Not yet. It is still relatively, if you look at the household debt to GDP ratio, it's on the very low side still. So for it to become a systemic concern, it needs to become much larger. And I think the RBI is seized of that.
Again, just switching gears, a mere 27% of the adults in India are financially literate with basic minimum standard as per an RBI report. How does one think about bringing up an ecosystem of financial education among people, and perhaps also in the education system itself? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not saying this is a matter of comfort, but the financial literacy rates in many developed countries aren't too different from this. And what we think as financial literacy may not be actually financial literacy either. I think it's sort of, well, I mean, RBI has lots of programs, and today there are many more information and resources available on the internet as well. But I think this is something that needs to happen from the school education level onwards. And it is not about getting introduced to the jargon or various investment options. It's about simply learning how to manage a budget at the household level. And even for many micro, small and medium enterprises, the ability to distinguish between business cash flows and personal cash flows, and what it means to bring down your working capital from, let's say, 28 days to 25 days, for example. These are all the important financial literacy. So what we think of as financial literacy is very different from the functional financial literacy that a typical household and a typical small business need. And there are some initiatives that are beginning to happen, especially in some private sector, where they are trying to tailor these specific financial literacy requirements of micro, small and medium enterprises. Those things have to become more ubiquitous. But I agree with the spirit of the question. It needs to go up, especially since retail participation in stock markets has gone up tremendously in the last 3 to 4 years. We are not sure if there is a concomitant increase in the awareness of the risks. It is not so much about the familiarity with the language, but it's the awareness of risks. What is my downside?
Right.
In anything that I do, and what is the probability of that? That they need to be at least aware of it.
There's another question is, why don't we have a sovereign wealth fund? And why can't we create one like many other countries have?
See, we have something sort of resembling that when we set up the National Investment Infrastructure Fund, and we will get there. I think some of these things are a function of the levels of overall national income and per capita income. Some of these institutions will automatically develop. The fact that we don't have one right now is also something to do with the fact that we are a current account deficit country and a capital importing country. And many of those countries that set up a sovereign wealth fund were capital surplus countries trying to look for investment opportunities. Here we are providing the investment opportunity to others, and that is a good state we are in for the moment.
So there are a lot of questions that have come about, and you also touched upon it in your talk on this entire thing of inclusion and a lot of things coming around gender and gender sensitivity in India, the inclusion, the participation of the women, girls, etc. And that's an important part of the whole agenda of inclusion. A lot of people want to hear your thoughts on how you think about that.
I think the labor force participation rate of women being on the lower side is one of the topics of discussion. And first thing we noticed when we took it up with the ILO, because ILO records that India has a lower women's labor force participation rate. And it was very interesting to hear from the economists concerned in ILO in Geneva saying that, frankly, your country is not measuring it properly on the way we recommend.
Okay.
If you are actually measuring it in the way we recommend, your official labor force participation rate will be actually higher than what you guys are reporting. Okay. I have it on authority. I have it on record from the ILO economist. It is that there are certain activities which may not be compensated, but they are counted as valid economic activity, contributing to valid economic activity, and we are not counting them properly. That is one part. But even after that, definitely we can talk about the macroeconomic benefits of augmenting the labor force participation rate. The way I would look at it from the government perspective is, ultimately, whether a person chooses to join the labor force or not should be her decision. But what the government can and should do and should continue to do is to make it possible for them to exercise that choice, which is in terms of providing the law and order, providing the workplace arrangements, providing the facilities that would make them possible to consider these choices, educational attainment, and the kind of legislation and labor code required for women not to feel discriminated in the workplace, etc. All these things that the governments around the country need to do must be done. But the final choice of whether I should be part of the workforce or will I be contributing better to myself and to my family by being part of the, by not being part of the labor force, is a choice that should be exercised by the person concerned. All that the government should do is to make sure that it doesn't systematically force them to make only one particular choice. That is the way I would look at the government's role in this.
There are a couple of reminders from the audience that you said you would talk about the Hindu article on EPFO data as a part.
No, I actually said that. I didn't agree with it.
Okay.
That's all.
That's okay. You only want to say that you didn't. Okay.
The contractual employment versus the permanent employment, etc. But the fact is that somebody is contributing, is becoming a member of the Provident Fund, and there is a contribution being made, is an employment generation that has happened, whether it is of a permanent nature or a contractual nature, etc. So I think, to me, the article sounded a little bit more of hair splitting than a substantive deficiency of EPFO. And I agree, EPFO net additions is not the most reliable measure of employment. After all, it only measures formal employment below a particular income threshold level, right? So what I rely on normally, just as I rely, for example, on a private financial institution's data on private sector capital formation. One of the institutional brokers in this country, a financial institution, looks at the balance sheets and the annual reports of all the companies in its coverage. And because the annual reports do mention the total employment, both the full-time employees and the contractual employees, they aggregate it and then calculate the formal sector employment growth. Unfortunately, this comes only once a year. So I rely on that. In that sense, reliance on EPFO, reliance on Manrega data, or reliance on PMI services and manufacturing surveys, or for that matter, RBI comes out every 2 months before the monetary policy meeting on business outlook, investment, and employment surveys. Those are also indicators, but all of them are only substitutes. There is eventually no substitute for the statistical agency in the country conducting quarterly employment surveys in rural and urban India, both at the household level and at the establishment level. Unfortunately, the establishment survey in India is even more dated than the rural employment survey. So we only have establishment level survey data for 21-22. So I agree that this is one area where much more work needs to be done for us to have a reliable, and especially with the GST data becoming more and more available, we should be able to get there and have a decent quality of employment data. That is no substitute to that.
Sure. No, but this is, and I think this comes up repeatedly, and this is again one of the things where half full and half empty kind of a thing. Given your vantage position and you see the quality of data, and both in your academic work and in your corporate career, compared to where we would be at our stage in development, how good is the quality of data in India? Because there is something that keeps coming up in different forums, and different people have views
I
on
think, again, as I said in the course of my remarks, as I said, I think many people have their own priors, and if the data confirm to those priors, then the data are deemed reliable, and if those priors are not confirmed, then the data becomes suspect. I think that's the problem. So I don't see, for example, I'll give you one small example. I will not name the country. IMF every year brings out an Article 4 assessment of the economies that are members of the fund. It's part of the instrument of membership, right? Every year, the fund will conduct an annual assessment. For one country, which is a large economy, the IMF publishes its country's annual estimate of fiscal deficit and government debt, but the IMF publishes its own estimate of the fiscal deficit and the government debt, apart from what the country gives. For India, the IMF doesn't do so.
Okay.
It takes the numbers given by us as the numbers and it projects on that basis. It doesn't say we have to qualify this and give our own estimates of the fiscal deficit and the government debt numbers. And one of the reasons why fiscal deficit went up to 9.2% of GDP in 2021 is partly because of the cleanup exercise that was undertaken to bring many of the below the line items to above the line. Where we are lacking, again, our GDP data may be, we have a problem in choosing the base year.
Right.
So we have 2011-12 as a basis. And you look at the index of industrial production. It is not that we are unreliable. We probably are underreporting because smartphones are not there.
Right.
In the index of industrial production, because it's still 2011-12 base. So what we need to do is, it's not that they're unreliable, probably we are actually erring on the other side of not fully capturing the transformation that has happened in the economy in the last 10 years or so. So we need to have a certain regularity and periodicity to updating the base year and moving on to chain weighted basis where the components are revised on an annual basis and the weights changed. But I wouldn't call them as unreliable or overstating the case in terms of positive growth or negative dimensions. It is just that we need to become much more regular in terms of the revisions of base year and the components, etc. And that, I think, is, again, I can say that it's in the works. We are aware of that. And we want to bring all of them onto a common base as soon as possible and then establish a certain automatic periodicity to their updation. We are working on that.
Sure. The one other thing I wanted to talk about was, we talked of technology and this, and there's some questions here as well. I also know you're personally a passionate follower of technology. How has the use of technology been on policy making? We talked of the effects on the economy, and that's uncertain. But in policy formulation itself, things like, you're in Bangalore, how can we let you go without talking of AI, ML and things like that?
No, I think on policy making, clearly on the taxation side and on improving the tax net, or for that matter, in the PLI schemes or in this Gati Shakti program, which allows the government to track implementation of projects and sequencing of projects. At the various steps in a project management. In all these cases, technology has come in extremely handy. I mean, PLI and Gati Shakti, as well as in tax network. This is where I think technology and data are being applied, and AI and ML are also being applied in money laundering activity detections and reporting of income. But beyond that, in policy formulation, how well they are playing, I would say that is difficult to sort of. You can see the direct relevance and effect on specific aspects of policy execution, not so much in formulation.
I think we're just about on time. Thank you so much, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, for this wonderful free-flowing talk.
Thank you.
On behalf of the BIC and Equitable University, thank you for it.
Thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed the interaction and look forward to coming back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll take you up on that. Thank you so much.